She arrived with nothing but a worn bag and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He hadn't spoken a kind word in 3 years. The valley said Frost Hollow Ranch would be dead by December, and the man who owned it might already be. They were wrong about the ranch. They were wrong about the man, and they had no idea what was coming for all of them. This is the story of two broken people, one frozen piece of land, and the fight that would change an entire valley forever. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The November wind came down from the mountains like something with a grudge. It swept across the high Wyoming plains in long, invisible waves, bending the brown grass flat, lifting loose hay from the fence posts, and carrying with it the particular kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin. It reached inside a man and settled around his bones like it intended to stay. By mid-morning, the sky over the Laramie Range had turned the color of old pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that made livestock restless and sensible people stay indoors. Silas Granger was not a sensible person, at least not in the way the valley defined the word. He was standing in his east pasture when most men would have been at a breakfast table, his worn leather gloves gripping a fence post that had been leaning at a 15-degree angle for the better part of a week. He'd been meaning to fix it. He'd been meaning to fix a lot of things. The list was long and growing longer, and lately he had stopped looking at it altogether because looking at it meant acknowledging just how many tasks required more than one pair of hands. Frost Hollow Ranch had once employed 4 full-time hands and 2 seasonal workers. That was 7 years ago, when his brother Daniel was alive, when the place hummed with activity from sunup to sundown, when the sound of voices arguing good-naturedly over supper had filled the main house every evening, like music. Now there was just Silas. He was 41 years old, though most people who'd encountered him in the past 3 years would have guessed closer to 50. Not because he was frail. Silas Granger was built like the kind of man who had never once been described as frail, but because grief had done something to his face that years alone couldn't undo. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't come from squinting into the sun. There was a set to his jaw that wasn't stubbornness so much as a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the world would not get the satisfaction of seeing him break. He drove the fence post deeper into the cold ground with 3 hard swings of a mallet, checked it, then drove it 3 more times for good measure. A horse nickered somewhere behind him. He didn't turn around. "I know," he said quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the land itself. "I'm working on it." He had been talking to the ranch lately. Just short sentences here and there. He wasn't sure when that had started. He told himself it was no different from a man thinking out loud, which was true enough. But there was something in it that went beyond thinking, something that was closer to keeping company with the only thing left in the world that hadn't let him down. Frost Hollow Ranch. 1,060 acres of high Wyoming grassland, backed against a ridge of pine-covered hills to the north, and dropping into a wide, flat basin to the south, where the creek ran in spring before pulling back to a thin thread in the dry months. The house was solid, stone foundation, 2 stories, built by Silas's grandfather in a time when men built things to outlast themselves. The barn was older and had been patched so many times that some sections were more patched than original structure. 3 outbuildings, a root cellar, a smokehouse that hadn't been used in 2 years, and a reputation. Every valley had its legends. Frost Hollows was Silas Granger, the man who'd driven away every ranch hand who'd come to work for him, who hadn't attended a community gathering since his brother's funeral, who once let a neighboring rancher's fencing crew do a full day of boundary work rather than come outside and say hello. People had long since stopped speculating about whether he was merely antisocial or genuinely dangerous, and had settled into a comfortable consensus that he was both. The truth, as truths often do, landed somewhere more complicated and more human than the legend. Silas drove one final swing into the post, pulled off his right glove, and pressed his palm flat against the cold wood. Solid. He nodded to himself, retrieved his tools, and turned back toward the house. That was when he saw the wagon. It was a battered buckboard being pulled by a single sorrel mare that looked nearly as tired as the woman holding the reins. The wagon had come in off the main road and was now rattling up the long gravel drive toward the house, moving slowly enough that Silas had time to stop walking entirely and watch its approach with the expression of a man who was calculating how much effort it would cost him to be unpleasant. He had placed the advertisement 2 weeks ago. He hadn't wanted to. But the simple arithmetic of winter had forced his hand. Too many acres, too many animals, too many tasks that two fists could not accomplish before the snows came. He'd written it in 3 sentences, sent it to the Clearwater Valley Gazette, and tried not to think about it. Ranch hand needed. Frost Hollow, north of Mill Haven. Hard work, fair pay, no nonsense. He hadn't expected a woman. The wagon stopped 20 feet from where he stood. The mare lowered her head and blew a long, tired breath that rose as steam in the cold air. The woman on the bench set the handbrake with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, then climbed down without hesitation or ceremony, landing on the gravel with the kind of economy of movement that comes from being accustomed to doing things without help. She was somewhere in her early 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that might have been called handsome if it weren't currently so hollowed by something that went beyond simple tiredness. She wore a wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, boots that had seen better years, and carried in her right hand a travel bag that appeared to contain everything she owned. A single bag. For everything. She looked at Silas across the distance between them, and he noticed her chin come up slightly, as if she'd already anticipated what his face was saying and had decided to preemptively disagree with it. "Silas Granger?" she said. Her voice was steady, though he could hear underneath the steadiness the particular flatness of someone who had been holding themselves together through force of will for a considerable time. "That's right," he said. "I'm Elena Hartwell. I'm here about the ranch hand position." A brief pause. "Before you say anything, I know how to work cattle, mend fence, winterize a root cellar, and cook for a working crew. I've done all of it, and I need this job." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the bag in her hand, then back at her face. "You come far?" he said. Something moved behind her eyes. "Far enough?" He turned around and walked toward the house. After 3 steps, he spoke over his shoulder. "There's coffee inside. It's terrible. Come in." The kitchen was exactly what Elena had expected and worse. Not filthy. She had prepared herself for filth and been surprised to find the house merely disordered, which was a different problem. Dishes were clean and stacked in a manner that suggested function without any interest in comfort. The table had papers on one end that had not been moved in what appeared to be months. The wood stove was operational and had a pot of coffee on it that had been on it too long. A window above the sink looked out onto the east pasture, and through it she could see the fence post that had clearly just been hammered into place, the disturbed earth around it still dark. She sat where he gestured, at the table's cleared end, and accepted a cup of coffee that was, as advertised, terrible. Silas sat across from her with his own cup and looked at her with the direct measuring gaze of a man who had learned that most people eventually looked away first. Elena did not look away. "You're a widow," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the ring she'd removed, or tried to remove. The faint pale line was still there on her finger. 8 months, she said. "I'm sorry." "Are you?" The words came out with more edge than she'd intended. She saw something flicker in his expression. Not offense, but something more like recognition. She softened her tone. "I mean, thank you. It's been a complicated 8 months. Where are you staying in Mill Haven?" A pause. "I'm not." Silas set down his coffee cup. "You drove out here without lodgings." "I drove out here with everything I have." She kept her voice level. "Which means, if you don't hire me, I'll need to figure something else out before dark. So if you're going to say no, say it now, and I'll get back on the road." Silas studied her. She watched him calculate. She'd become practiced at reading the calculations men made when they looked at her. All the things they were adding and subtracting and weighing. Most of those calculations ended badly for her. But Silas Granger's calculations seemed different. He wasn't looking at her the way she'd come to dread being looked at. He was looking at her like a man who was trying to determine if she was telling the truth. After a moment, he said, "The work is hard. Starts before dawn, ends after dark. I don't require conversation, and I don't provide it. You'll have your own room. That room gets locked from the inside, and that's your business. Pay is $15 a month plus board. There are no other hands." "When do I start?" He stood, picked up both cups, and set them in the basin. "You already started." Mill Haven, Wyoming was a town of roughly 400 souls, 12 businesses, 1 church, 1 school, and 1 doctor who also served as the dentist and occasional veterinarian in cases of particular desperation. It sat in the southeastern corner of the Clearwater Valley, flanked by rangeland that rolled away in every direction toward distant mountain ridges. It was also, like every small town in every territory that has ever existed, a sophisticated and well-organized engine of gossip. By the second evening after Elena Hartwell's arrival at Frost Hollow Ranch, the matter had been thoroughly discussed in the general store, the barbershop, and the back room of the Millhaven Hotel, where certain men of the valley's ranching community were known to congregate. By the end of the week, positions had been staked and opinions calcified. Clara Whitmore, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a military commander and the moral certainty of a judge, was among the most vocal. She was also the most frequently consulted. A young widow, she announced to the three women who happened to be in the store on a Thursday morning when the topic inevitably arose. Living alone, on that ranch, with Silas Granger, of all people. "He's not a bad man, Clara," said Margaret Flynn, who was married to the doctor and therefore permitted a slightly more liberal view of human nature. "He's just private." Private? Clara made the word sound like a diagnosis. "He hasn't spoken to a soul outside of business necessity in 3 years, and now he's taken on a woman as a ranch hand?" She let that sit in the air the way a skilled orator lets a pause work for them. "It raises questions." "It raises questions in your mind," Margaret said, "in every sensible mind." What Clara Whitmore and the other sensible minds of Millhaven did not know, could not see from the comfortable distance of the town's warm interiors, was what was actually happening at Frost Hollow Ranch. They had constructed a story from what they could observe, and what they could observe was a woman arriving and not leaving. The story they built around that observation had very little to do with the truth. The truth was this: Elena Hartwell worked. She started before him. The first morning, Silas came downstairs at 4:45, which was his customary time, and found the kitchen already warm and coffee already made. Not the previous day's bitterness reheated, fresh coffee, correctly brewed. A pan of cornbread sat on the back of the stove, covered with a cloth. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment and looked at these things with the expression of a man who has discovered something unexpected but doesn't yet know how to feel about it. He made himself not feel anything about it. He poured coffee, ate a square of cornbread, and went to work. But the next morning it was the same, and the morning after that. She learned the ranch with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge was its own form of safety. Within 3 days she had walked every fence line. Within a week she knew which cattle were prone to separating from the herd, which water troughs froze fastest in the morning cold, which section of the south pasture drained poorly and would become a mud trap if the temperature rose above freezing for more than 2 days running. She worked without complaint and without excessive conversation, which Silas had expected to find suspect, but instead found he didn't mind. What he hadn't expected was what she did to the house. It happened gradually, which was perhaps why he didn't resist it. A cracked window pane was replaced. He came home one afternoon to find it already done, the broken glass removed, the new pane set with careful precision. Curtains that had hung gray with dust were taken down, washed, and rehung. The papers on the kitchen table, which he'd been meaning to file and hadn't for 11 months, were sorted, stacked, and placed on the desk in his office with a brief note in her handwriting explaining the organizational system she'd used. He stood in the kitchen that evening, looking at the clear table, and felt something he couldn't immediately name. He named it later, lying awake in the room above, listening to the wind work its way around the eaves. The house felt inhabited, not just occupied, inhabited. There was a difference he hadn't fully understood until that moment, a difference between a space where someone merely existed and a space where someone was living. He'd been the former for 3 years. He hadn't noticed until contrast made it visible. He didn't say anything to her about it. He wasn't sure what he would say, and he'd learned over the years of his own company that not saying things was almost always the safer choice. But he noticed. The first real conversation happened by accident, the way real conversations often do. It was the second Friday of Elena's time at the ranch, close to 9 in the evening, and Silas was at the desk in his office attempting to make sense of a feed bill that didn't reconcile with his own records. He'd been at it for an hour and was developing a particular brand of arithmetic frustration that he expressed by absolute stillness, which to an outside observer might have looked like concentration, but was actually closer to silent rage. He heard her in the hallway, heading toward the stairs, and then the footsteps stopped. A long pause. "It's the July delivery," Elena said from the doorway. Silas looked up. She was holding a small ledger, not one he'd given her, one she'd apparently obtained for her own use in tracking the ranch's daily operations. She was pointing at a line in it without quite entering the room. The July delivery came in 2 shipments, she continued. The bill combined them. Your records show 1 payment because you made 1 payment, but there were 2 invoices being combined into the total. It's not wrong. It's just confusing the way it's written. He looked at the bill, then at her ledger, which she held so he could see the relevant entries. You've been keeping a ranch ledger, he said. I've been keeping track, she said carefully, as if aware she might have overstepped. It helps me understand the operation. If that's a problem, show me. He moved the bill and gestured to the chair across the desk. She sat, placed the ledger on the desk between them, and walked him through it. She had in 2 weeks created a clear and precise record of every task completed, every supply used, every observation about the livestock and the land. It was better than anything he'd maintained himself. He read through it in silence for several minutes. When he looked up, she was watching him with careful neutrality. You've run an operation before, he said, a shift behind her eyes. Brief, contained. My husband's farm. Before we lost it. Lost it how? The same way most people lose things. She picked up the ledger. Debt and bad luck and someone willing to take advantage of both. She stood. The invoices. If you keep them filed by delivery date rather than arrival date, it won't happen again. She walked out. Silas sat for a moment, looking at the space where she'd been sitting, then at the bill in his hand, then at the window where the darkness had settled over the ranch like a blanket. He said, which for Silas Granger was quite a lot. November became December. The snows came early, which was unusual, and hard, which was not. Frost Hollow Ranch buckled into winter mode. Shorter days, longer work, the particular rhythm of cold weather ranching that allowed very little margin for error and required constant vigilance. Animals needed extra feed, water sources needed daily clearing, pipes needed watching, hay stores needed monitoring against the length of winter ahead. Silas and Elena worked in proximity and occasional silence that was no longer quite the same quality of silence it had been in the beginning. Somewhere in the accumulation of early mornings and long evenings and shared work, the silence had become not comfortable exactly, but mutual. A recognized terrain between 2 people who had both learned that quiet was not the same thing as absence. He taught her things she hadn't encountered in her previous experience. The specific behavior of high-altitude cattle in winter, the early signs of respiratory illness in horses exposed to cold air, the trick of reading the northern ridge for signs of weather 24 hours before it arrived. She received all of it with the attentive seriousness of someone who understood that competence was survival and that there was no such thing as knowing too much. She taught him things too, though she did it obliquely, the way you'd offer something to a man you suspected might reject it if it were offered directly. She reorganized the root cellar so that its contents were accessible and properly labeled. She found, in the old smokehouse, equipment that had been unused and forgotten and had it functional within a week. She quietly, without announcement, fixed a leak in the roof of the smaller outbuilding that had been causing slow damage to the storage inside for what appeared to be 2 winters running. He found out about the roof when he went to retrieve a piece of equipment and noticed the dry floor. He stood there for a moment in the doorway of the outbuilding, looking at the dry floor. Then he went and found her in the barn, where she was working on a harness repair, and said, "The outbuilding roof." She looked up. The leak was getting into the far corner. The hay was starting to mold. "When did you say?" "Last week. I had 2 hours in the afternoon." He looked at her for a moment. She went back to the harness repair. "Elena." She looked up again. He almost said something. He could see himself, as if from a slight distance, on the verge of saying something real, something that would cost him something. He wasn't sure he remembered how. "Good work," he said instead. Something crossed her face. Not disappointment exactly, something more patient than that. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the harness. There was a boy. His name was Toby Reed, and he was 16, and he arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday in December, recommended by the farrier in Mill Haven as a young man who needed work badly enough to be reliable and who could drive a wagon and handle horses. Silas hired him for 3 days a week on the basis of a 5-minute conversation, and then told Elena, not asked her, which she accepted without visible reaction. Toby was a lanky, red-haired boy with the particular combination of earnestness and terror that characterized young men new to hard work, and trying not to show either quality too obviously. He arrived his first morning at 5 a.m., a full half hour before he was expected, and found Elena already in the barn and Silas already in the east pasture. "Ma'am," he said, stopping just inside the barn door, "I'm Toby Reed. Mr. Granger hired me." Elena looked him over with the same efficient assessment she applied to most things. "I know. Can you muck out these 3 stalls without being told which end of a shovel to use?" Toby blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Start there. I'll be outside." She walked past him. He watched her go, then looked at the stalls, then picked up a shovel and started. He was halfway through the 3rd stall when Silas came in from the pasture, looked at the progress, and said only, "Faster." Toby went faster. By afternoon, he had found the rhythm that good ranch work required. A steady, sustainable pace that prioritized accuracy over speed, but didn't waste a movement. Elena noticed it and said nothing, which Toby would come to understand was, from her, a form of approval. Silas noticed it and said nothing, which Toby would come to understand was, from him, a contract extension. The 3 of them settled into a pattern that winter. Different in disposition, different in history, different in what they needed and what they carried. But the work bound them the way work does, through the sharing of cold mornings and hard tasks, and the particular satisfaction of a thing done right. Frost Hollow Ranch was not flourishing. It was too early, too hard a winter, too many repairs still needed. But it was functioning. It was alive. For the first time in 3 years, the lights were on in the house when darkness fell. It was a Thursday evening in mid-December when Elena first heard the name that would come to define the months ahead. She was in the kitchen after supper, the day's ledger open on the table, making notes by lamplight, when Silas came through the back door from a late check on the south pasture fence. He hung up his coat and hat and stood by the stove to warm his hands, and his face had a quality she had not seen in it before. Not closed off, as was his usual state, but occupied, processing something. She waited. "Harlan Pruitt lost his north pasture today," Silas said finally, to the stove. She looked up. "Lost it how?" "Sold. Under pressure." He turned around. "To a man named Damian Crow." She had heard the name once, in passing, at the general store in Millhaven 2 weeks prior, in a conversation she hadn't paid much attention to because the context had been too vague. She paid attention now. "Who is he, Pat?" "Railroad money. Come down from back east." Silas pulled out a chair and sat across from her at the table. Something he'd never done in the evening, only at breakfast. It was, Elena realized, a signal that he intended to talk, which was itself unusual enough to require attention. "He's been buying land in the valley for 6 months, quiet, at first, small parcels. Nobody thought much of it. And now?" Silas looked at her. "And now Harlan Pruitt's family has worked that land for 22 years, and he sold it in 2 days. He told me his well went bad last month. Couldn't figure out why. Then 2 of his fence lines came down overnight. Then his best cattle dog turned up dead for no reason anyone could account for." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls. "And then Crow came with an offer," Elena said. "Low offer. Harlan took it anyway." Silas's jaw tightened. "He has 4 kids." Elena closed the ledger slowly. She had heard the story before, in a different form, with different names. The specifics varied. The shape of it never did. "How many acres has Crow acquired?" she asked. "Nobody's tracking it precise. But if you draw a line on a map of this valley, there's a picture starting to form. He's buying along the eastern corridor, land that sits between the main road and the rail spur that's coming through in 2 years. The rail spur makes that land worth 4 times what he's paying." 5 times, Silas said, once it's complete. She looked at him across the table, and in that moment they both understood exactly what this was and exactly what it would mean if it reached Frost Hollow Ranch. "He'll come here," she said. "Yes." "When?" "When he's ready." Silas stood, pushed back his chair. "Get some sleep. The south pasture fence needs work before the next front comes through." He went upstairs. Elena sat for a long time in the lamplight after he was gone, one hand resting on the closed ledger, looking at the wall. She was not afraid exactly. She had been afraid, in real fear of actual danger, for enough of the past 8 months that she'd developed a kind of clinical relationship with the sensation. She recognized it and cataloged it and decided what to do with it. What she was feeling now was not quite fear, it was more like recognition. And under the recognition, a quiet, cold resolve. She opened the ledger again to a fresh page, picked up her pen, and wrote at the top, Damien Crowe, Eastern Corridor, November. Then she began to write down everything she knew. The name Damien Crowe spread through Clearwater Valley the way a cold spreads through a schoolhouse. Quietly at first, one person at a time, and then all at once, until everyone was sick with the knowledge of it and nobody quite knew how to get well. By January, 3 more ranchers had sold. By the first week of February, the number was 6. Elena kept writing in the ledger. She had filled 12 pages by the time the pattern became impossible to ignore, even for people who badly wanted to ignore it. The Eastern Corridor acquisitions. The timing of each sale, always preceded in the weeks before by some misfortune that the affected rancher struggled to explain and the town struggled to attribute to anything specific. A well gone bad here. A fence line collapsed there. Cattle spooked and scattered on a night when no storm had come through. A storage barn found smoldering on a Tuesday morning, the cause undetermined, the damage just severe enough to strain a family's winter reserves without being severe enough to warrant a marshal's investigation. Misfortune. That was the word people used. The valley was having a run of misfortune. Elena did not believe in misfortune. She believed in cause, and she believed in intent. And when she laid her 12 pages of notes across the kitchen table one Sunday morning and arranged them chronologically, what she saw was neither random nor unlucky. What she saw was a method. Patient, calculated, and precise. The kind of method that required not just money, but organizational intelligence. Someone was coordinating this. Someone who understood that a man could withstand one disaster but might surrender after 3, and that surrender dressed as a sale was cleaner than any alternative. Silas stood across the table and read through her notes in silence. He read them twice. Then he looked up. "You've been tracking all of this since December," he said. "Since the night you told me about Harlan Pruitt." He studied her face. "Why didn't you show me sooner?" "Because I needed enough of it to matter." She set her finger on the 3rd page. "Look at the interval. Every incident happens between 8 and 12 days before Crowe or one of his people makes contact. It's not coincidence, it's a pressure cycle. He applies enough damage to weaken resolve, waits for the wound to settle in, then arrives with an offer while the rancher is still in the worst of it." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the February wind pressed against the kitchen window with a low, persistent moan. "He'll come here," he said. It was the same thing he'd said in December, but with different weight now. Not a prediction, a certainty. "He'll come here," she agreed. "And when he does, you'll be in a better position if you're not standing alone." Silas looked at her with an expression that was, for him, dangerously close to readable. "You want me to talk to the other ranchers?" "I want us to talk to them." She held his gaze. "You have history with these people. They know your name, even if they haven't seen your face in a while. That matters. My name doesn't carry much warmth in this valley." "It carries weight," she said. "That's different, and right now, weight is what they need." He pulled out a chair and sat down, which she had learned meant he was genuinely considering something rather than reflexively rejecting it. She gave him the silence to think in, which she had also learned was something he required. After a while, he said, "Who do we start with?" She had already thought about this. "Frank Alderman. He's the largest independent operator left in the valley, and he hasn't sold, which means either Crowe hasn't gotten to him yet, or Alderman is harder to move than the others. Either way, he's the one whose name will bring the rest of them to a table. Alderman and I haven't spoken in 4 years." "Why not?" A pause. "Boundary dispute." "Who was right?" "I was." "Did you handle it well?" A longer pause. "No." Elena gathered her pages and squared them into a neat stack. "Then you'll apologize for how you handled it, and you'll explain what's happening in this valley, and Frank Alderman will listen because he's a practical man, and this is a practical matter." She looked up at him. "Can you do that?" Silas Granger sat with the expression of a man who would rather drive fence posts in frozen ground for 12 consecutive hours than say the word sorry to Frank Alderman. But he was also, underneath all of it, a man who could recognize necessity when it was laid in front of him. "I can do that," he said. He didn't sound happy about it. Elena didn't require him to sound happy about it. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll drive." He almost said something about that. She saw it cross his face. Then it left, and he nodded once and stood up and went to the back door and put on his coat and went outside, which was what Silas Granger did when he needed to process something without an audience. Elena looked at the stack of pages. Then she picked up her pen and started a 13th page. There was always more to write down. The meeting with Frank Alderman took place not at a kitchen table, but in Alderman's barn, which was his preferred location for conversations he considered serious. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a white beard and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had learned, over decades, that haste was the primary cause of most mistakes. He listened to Silas's opening, which included, to Elena's genuine respect, a brief and unqualified acknowledgement that the boundary dispute 4 years ago had been handled badly, without changing his expression at all. When Silas finished, Alderman looked at Elena. "You put this together?" he said, meaning the documented record she had placed in his hands. "Yes." "You've been at Frost Hollow how long?" 3 months. He looked at the pages again. "You do this kind of work before?" "I kept records on my husband's farm." She paused. "We lost the farm. I wish I'd started keeping records sooner." Something shifted in Alderman's face. Not pity. He wasn't a man given to pity, but acknowledgement. He handed the pages back and looked at Silas. "The Ketterly brothers won't come to any meeting you call," he said. "Too much old history. But they'll come if I call it." He stroked his beard. "I'll call it." "When?" Silas asked. "Saturday. My place. Tell no one outside of the people I invite." Elena nodded. "One more thing," she said. "Don't discuss this at the general store, the barber shop, or anywhere Clara Whitmore might be within 100 yards. Alderman looked at her with the first trace of something close to amusement. "You've been in this valley 3 months and you already know about Clara Whitmore." "I made it my business," she said. He almost smiled. "Saturday," he said. 7 in the evening. Come through the east gate." They drove home mostly in silence, the wagon moving through a landscape that was still white and hard with winter cold, the mountains to the north sitting clear and distant against a sky that had gone the pale blue of late afternoon. Toby had stayed back to manage the afternoon chores, and Elena was glad for the quiet. She needed to think. She was aware, sitting next to Silas on the wagon bench, that something had shifted between them since this morning. It was subtle, a fractional reduction in the distance he habitually maintained, a change in the quality of his silence from guarded to something more companionable. She didn't draw attention to it. She filed it away in the same practiced manner she filed everything, and kept her eyes on the road. "You handled that well," she said after a while. He was quiet for a moment. "Which part?" "The apology. It landed right." He looked at the horses' backs. "I practiced it." She turned to look at him. The admission seemed to have surprised even him. His jaw was set in the way it set when he'd said something he hadn't entirely planned to say. "In the barn," he continued, staring ahead. "This morning, before we left." Elena faced forward again. She felt something move in her chest that she didn't examine too closely. "That's not weakness," she said quietly. "That took more courage than most men would spend." Silas said nothing, but he didn't disagree. The Saturday meeting was held in Frank Alderman's hay barn by lantern light, with 8 ranchers present and one notable absence in the form of the Ketterly brothers, who had sent word that they were interested but not yet ready to be seen interested, which was the kind of political caution that Elena recognized and chose not to argue with. 8 was enough to start. 8 ranchers, their combined operations representing more than 7,000 acres of Clearwater Valley rangeland, sitting on overturned feed buckets and hay bales, speaking in the kind of low voices that men used when they understood that the wrong person overhearing the wrong conversation could cost them everything. Elena stood to one side and let Silas begin. He was not by nature a man built for speeches. He knew this and worked with it rather than against it. He kept it short, factual, and specific, which proved far more effective than eloquence would have been with this particular audience. He laid out what they knew, the pattern of incidents, the acquisition timeline, the calculated pressure cycle Elena had identified. Then he placed her documented record on the nearest surface and said, "Every rancher who's sold, Pruitt, the Holloways, Becker, all of them, every one of them had 3 incidents, minimum, in the 2 weeks before Crow arrived. This isn't bad luck. Someone is doing this to you." The barn was quiet for a moment in a way that barns in winter are not normally quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a group of people who have each individually suspected something and are now, for the first time, hearing it confirmed by someone else's voice. Then Roy Deming, a lean, weathered man in his late 40s who ran a cattle operation to the west of Frost Hollow, said, "I had a well go bad in November." Silas looked at him. "And a fence line down," Deming continued. His voice was careful and flat. "2 weeks before Christmas. Nobody came to see me about buying, so I figured it was just—" He stopped. "Just misfortune," Elena said. Deming met her eyes. "Yeah." "How many of you," Elena asked, looking around the barn, "have had at least one incident in the last 4 months that you couldn't fully explain?" 7 hands went up. The 8th man, a younger rancher named Cass Beaumont, looked around at the raised hands and then slowly raised his own, as if he'd only just connected his own experience to the pattern being described. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and ended with a resolution that Alderman framed in his direct, unornamented way. "We don't sell. Not one of us. Not to Crow. Not to any name he sends. And we don't let anyone in this room stand alone when something happens. You have trouble, you send word. We come." There were 8 nods and 1 handshake that passed around the circle. Not ceremonial, not dramatic, simply the physical enactment of a decision made by practical men who had decided to trust each other. After the others had gone, Alderman walked Silas and Elena to their wagon. He paused by the horse, one hand resting on the sorrel mare's neck. "Crow's going to find out about this," he said. "I know," Silas said. "When he does, he'll push harder." "I know that too." Alderman looked at Elena. "You ready for that?" She held his gaze steadily. "Are you?" He studied her for a long moment. Then he patted the mare's neck and stepped back. "Get home safe," he said. "Roads ice up fast this time of night." He went back inside. They drove home in darkness, the lantern on the wagon's side rail casting a small orange circle of warmth against the vast surrounding cold. The pushing began in March. It came first for Roy Deming, a 3rd fence line in a single week, this one on the boundary closest to the main road, impossible to attribute to weather or age. Then for a rancher named Josiah Holt, whose grain supply was found contaminated with something that killed 2 horses before anyone understood what had happened. Then the Beaumont place, where a fire started in the equipment shed at 2 in the morning under conditions that left no natural explanation. Each time the alliance moved, ranchers arrived with tools and hands and, in the case of Beaumont's fire, with water wagons. What Crow's people had designed to isolate and demoralize instead had the opposite effect. Every incident drew the circle of trust tighter, added to Elena's documentation, and gave the ranchers something they hadn't expected to acquire from any of this: each other. Elena was at the Beaumont place the morning after the fire, standing in the cold ash and asking careful questions while Cass Beaumont's wife moved through the wreckage with the mechanical numbness of shock. She wrote down everything. She noted the pattern of the burn, the location of origin, the absence of any lamp or lantern or heat source that could explain it. She wrote down the time Beaumont had last checked the shed and the time he'd seen the first smoke. On the ride back to Frost Hollow, Silas drove while she wrote, the wagon moving through early March mud that sucked at the wheels and slowed everything. "He's escalating," she said, not looking up from the page. "Because we're not braking," Silas said. "We need to be further ahead of him." She finished a line and looked up. "The documentation we have is strong for a civil case, but what we need is something that ties him directly. Not just the pattern, an actual link between Crow's operation and the incidents." "How do you get that?" "Someone who knows something and is willing to say it." She paused. "One of his hired men, eventually, will decide the money isn't worth the exposure. That's when it matters that we have a lawyer ready to receive testimony." Silas glanced at her. "You've already been in contact with a lawyer." It wasn't a question. She had learned to read his inflections. "A firm in Cheyenne," she confirmed. "I wrote to them 6 weeks ago. They've agreed to represent the Alliance's interests on a deferred fee basis, contingent on the quality of evidence we can provide. Another silence. She watched the field move past the side of the wagon, brown and rutted and edged with the last hard patches of winter ice. But underneath it, she knew, the ground was beginning to thaw. "You did all of this without telling me," he said. She looked at him. "Would you have told me not to?" He thought about it. "No." "Then I didn't need to tell you first. I needed to make sure it was real before I said it out loud." She paused. "There's something else." "Of course there is. I've been making copies of everything, every document, every statement, every page of the ledger. I send copies to the Cheyenne firm at the end of every week, by post, under a name Crow won't recognize." She watched his face. "Nothing we have here can be made to disappear. It already exists somewhere else." Silas was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd finally, after all this time, reached the edge of what he would accept without discussion. Then he said, "Smart." She returned to the page she'd been writing. "I learned from watching what happened to people who didn't do it." Frost Hollow Ranch received its first visit from a representative of Damian Crow's operation on a cold Tuesday afternoon in late March. He arrived in a clean buggy with brass fittings on the harness, which was the kind of detail that people in working ranch country noticed and did not think well of. He was a soft-faced man in an expensive coat who gave his name as Prescott and his role as land acquisition consultant, which Elena, listening from inside the house, translated precisely as what it was. She watched through the window as the man spoke with Silas in the yard. She could not hear the words at this distance, but she didn't need to. She had imagined this conversation many times. She watched Silas's posture still unhurried, giving nothing, and watched the consultant's gestures grow slightly more animated as the conversation continued. After approximately 4 minutes, Silas turned and walked toward the house. The consultant called something after him. Silas did not turn around. He came inside, closed the door, and stood in the entrance hallway with his coat still on. "He offered me $12,000 for the property," he said. Elena did the arithmetic she'd done weeks ago. "It's worth at least 40. I told him no." "What did he say?" Silas looked at her steadily. "He said Mr. Crow hoped I would reconsider, and that decisions made now tended to be better than decisions made later, under pressure." The kitchen felt very still. "He threatened you," she said. "He was polite about it." "They're always polite the first time." She moved to the window. The consultant's buggy was already moving back down the drive. She watched it go. "He'll report back, and Crow will decide how to respond. We have time." "Some." She turned from the window. "We use it." What they did with the time was this. Elena called a second meeting of the Alliance, this one at Frost Hollow, and presented every rancher with a sealed copy of the accumulated documentation. She walked them through the Cheyenne firm's involvement. She explained exactly what the copies sent weekly to that firm represented, and what it meant for any action Crow might take against any member of the Alliance. She watched the faces around the table as she spoke. Some of them were afraid, genuinely, plainly afraid, in the way that men who have built things with their own hands are afraid of losing them. She didn't try to eliminate the fear. Fear was information. What she tried to give them, alongside the fear, was something more durable. "He is counting on you standing alone," she said at the end. "Every person in this room standing alone and deciding that the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of surrender. That calculation only works if you're actually alone." She looked around the table. "You are not alone." Frank Alderman, at the far end of the table, said, "What happens when he stops asking politely?" The room went quiet. Elena looked at him. "Then we find out what we're made of." Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Outside, the late March wind moved through the pine trees on the ridge above the ranch, and the sound of it came through the walls the way wind always came through those walls, not as a threat, but as a reminder. This land was old and hard, and did not bend for anyone who hadn't earned the right to stand on it. Silas, who had sat at the head of the table in silence throughout most of the meeting, spoke then for the first time. "We'll hold," he said. Just that. 2 words. But the way he said them settled into the room like something load-bearing. Nobody argued, and nobody left early. The fire came 17 days later. It came at 2 in the morning on a night when the wind was high enough to carry sparks like living things, and the first sign of it was the orange glow that Toby Reed saw through his bunkhouse window when he got up in the night and happened to look toward the barn. He ran. He was screaming before he reached the house door. Inside the main house, Silas was already on his feet by the time Toby hit the porch. Some part of him had registered a sound or a smell, or some change in the air that pulled him from sleep a half second before the boy's voice broke through the night. Elena was 3 steps behind Silas, coat pulled over her shoulders, already moving before she fully understood what she was moving toward. And then she saw it, and she understood. The barn was burning. The barn was a wall of orange and black, flames climbing the old timber framing with the particular hunger of fire that has been given a head start. The wind, high and relentless, pushed the heat outward in waves, and the sound of it was not the quiet crackling of a hearth, but something deeper and more violent, a low roar underneath the sharper crack and pop of burning wood. Silas ran without hesitation. He didn't think about it. Later, when Elena tried to reconstruct the sequence of events in her mind, she would realize that the 3 of them had moved entirely on instinct, that in the space between Toby's scream and the moment they reached the barn doors, no one had spoken a word or made a deliberate decision. There had simply been the fire and the horses inside it, and the knowledge shared among all 3 of them without discussion that the horses were coming out. The large barn doors were already warm when Silas hit them with his shoulder. He forced them back, and the air from inside rushed out to meet him. Heat and smoke and the high breaking sound of horses in terror, which is one of the worst sounds a rancher ever hears, a sound that bypasses rational thought and lands somewhere older and more urgent. "Get the far stalls first," Elena called over the noise. She had grabbed a length of burlap from the supply rack just inside the entrance and was already moving toward the water barrel they kept near the south wall. She doused the burlap, handed half to Toby when he appeared at her elbow, and wrapped the rest around her own lower face. The smoke was dense and directionless, thickened by the closed space and the specific composition of old seasoned timber and hay. Silas had gone left, toward the 4 stalls that housed the working horses, the ones they used daily, the ones worth the most, and also the ones most likely to be panicked past the point of leading. Elena moved right, toward the 2 draft horses at the far end, older and steadier animals that might respond to a known voice even in this. "Easy," she said, pulling down the stall door of the nearer one, a big roan gelding named Carpenter that she had fed by hand every morning for 4 months. "Easy, Carpenter, come on, I've got you, come on." The horse was trembling so hard she could feel it through the air between them. His eyes were white-rimmed and rolling, and for one terrible moment she thought he was past reaching. Then she put her hand flat on his neck and kept her voice at the same low, steady pitch that she used every morning, the same tone she used when everything was calm, the particular frequency of normalcy that she was counting on his memory to recognize. He stepped forward. She got him out. Then the second draft horse, a mare named Belle, who followed Carpenter with the herd logic of long partnership. She turned back for the door and ran into Toby coming the other way with one of the working horses, a young chestnut that was barely contained, all 4 feet skittering on the barn floor, eyes wild, the boy's arms fully extended on the lead rope and his boots barely keeping purchase on the ground. "Take her," he shouted, and transferred the rope to Elena's hands and turned back without waiting. Elena braced, dug in, and walked the chestnut backward through the barn entrance into the night air. The horse hit the cold outside air, and some animal calculation shifted in her. The fire was behind, the open dark was forward, and she moved. Elena let the rope out, kept hold of the end, and the chestnut ran a tight circle in the yard, slowing as the distance from the heat and noise increased, coming back finally to a trembling standstill, with her head low and her sides heaving. Elena tied her to the paddock fence and turned back. The east section of the barn roof caved in with a sound like a cannon shot. She felt the concussion of it in her chest before she heard it properly, a deep percussive blow that rolled across the yard and sent a column of sparks upward into the black sky. For one suspended moment the sparks hung there, rising, and then the wind caught them and Elena's stomach dropped because the wind was blowing them directly toward the smaller outbuilding 20 yards to the east. "Silas!" She was already moving. "The east building! The sparks!" He came out of the barn at a run, one horse's lead in his fist and another tied to his belt by a length of rope, in a solution that spoke to the specific improvisation of a man who has run out of hands. He looked where she was pointing, took in the sparks settling on the outbuilding's dry roof, and said something under his breath that she didn't catch but understood from the tone. "Bucket line," he said. "The well, now." The three of them formed it, Silas at the well, Toby running, Elena at the outbuilding, pouring water over the eave where the first wisps of smoke were beginning to rise from the sparks catching on old shingles. The buckets were heavy, and the trips were long, and the fire in the barn continued to roar behind them as they worked, the light of it orange and absolute, lighting the entire yard as bright as a damaged noon. They worked for what felt like a very long time, and was probably 40 minutes. When the immediate threat to the outbuilding was contained and the barn fire had eaten through its own fuel and begun to pull back from the walls still standing, Silas set down a bucket and stood in the yard and looked at what remained. The east half of the barn was gone. The roof had collapsed inward over the last 3 stalls. Empty stalls, all the horses out. The west wall was standing, blackened and heat-warped, but structural. The loft was gone. The hay inside was ash. Months of stored feed, tools, equipment, a saddle rack that had belonged to his grandfather, ash and charred timber. He stood very still and looked at it. Toby sat down on the ground nearby because his legs had stopped cooperating. He was 16 years old, and he was shaking, and he had smoke in his lungs that would make him cough for 3 days. And he was also, underneath all of that, quietly and privately, the kind of proud that doesn't announce itself, the pride of someone who has done a hard thing and knows it. Elena stood beside Silas, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, which for both of them, people who had learned to maintain distance as a form of protection, was significant without being stated. "All 6 horses," she said. Silas said nothing. "All 6 horses are out," she repeated more gently. "The west wall is standing, the outbuilding held." She paused. It could have been worse. He turned to look at her. His face in the diminishing firelight was something she had not seen from him before. Not closed off, not guarded, but raw and tired in the particular way of a man who has held himself together through an emergency and now, with the emergency subsiding, is feeling the full weight of what it cost. "I know," he said quietly. She held his gaze. Neither of them looked away. After a moment, she said, "Toby, go inside. There's water on the stove. Drink something warm." "I'm fine," Toby said, still sitting on the ground. "I know you are. Go inside anyway." He went. Silas looked back at the ruined east section of the barn. This was Crow. "Yes." "He's done waiting." "Yes." She folded her arms against the cold, the night having reasserted itself now that the heat of the fire was dying. "And we can't prove it. Not yet. Not the way a court would require." "I don't need a court, I need—" He stopped. She waited. "I need to think," he said finally. The anger in his voice was real and carefully contained, the way a man contains something when he knows that acting on it immediately would cost him the advantage. She recognized the discipline in it, respected it. "We both do," she said. "Tomorrow. Tonight, we make sure the animals are settled and the structure that's left isn't going to shift." He nodded once. They went back to work. In the morning, the valley arrived. It started with Frank Alderman, who had seen the glow on the horizon from his own place 10 miles south, and had not waited for word. He came at dawn with 2 of his hands and a wagon loaded with lumber. Behind him, within the hour, came Roy Deming and Cass Beaumont and Josiah Holt, some with tools and some with food, and all with the specific quiet anger of people who have understood, finally and completely, that the attack on Frost Hollow was an attack on all of them. They filled the yard. They assessed the damage with the efficient, unsentimental eyes of ranchers who knew construction and destruction both, and then they began, without ceremony or instruction, to work. Elena moved through it all with the ledger she had gone upstairs to retrieve before the first wagon arrived. She documented everything: the burn pattern, the origin point of the fire, the structural damage, the probable accelerant traces she found on the ground near the barn's south corner where the fire appeared to have been set, the footprints in the dirt that the fire crew had been careful, at her request, not to disturb before she'd recorded them. Alderman came to stand beside her while she was sketching the burn pattern. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm recording evidence," she said, "for when we have the rest of it." He looked at the footprints, at the sketch in the ledger. "You know how to do this." I know how to pay attention, she said, which is the same thing, done long enough. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? She looked up at him. I need anyone in this valley who has seen anything, anything at all connected to Crow's people, to write it down and sign it. Dates, descriptions, what was said, what was done. Every witness account we can gather, notarized if possible. That'll take time. Less time than losing this valley takes. She met his eyes. Will you help me? Already am, he said, and went back to the rebuild. The work continued for 3 days. By the end of it, the west wall had been reinforced, the debris cleared, and a temporary structure erected over the remaining stalls that would hold through the rest of the Wyoming spring. It was not the barn it had been, but it was standing. On the 4th morning after the fire, Silas found Elena at the kitchen table before dawn, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the number of pages spread across the table and the expression on her face, which was not the focused calm of her normal working state, but something more tightly wound. He poured coffee and sat across from her without being invited, which had become, over the winter and into this spring, simply the way things worked between them. Talk, he said. She organized the pages into a sequence. I've been in contact with the Cheyenne firm every week, as I told you. 3 days ago, I received a response from them that changes our position. She slid a letter across the table. They have a contact in the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne who has been quietly examining Crow's acquisition filings. Several of them contain irregularities, documents that were filed after the fact with backdated signatures, discrepancies in witness names. Silas read the letter. His expression didn't change dramatically, but she had learned to read the small shifts. Something in his eyes sharpened. Forged documents, he said. Potentially. The land office contact can't say so officially without a formal investigation, but it means Crow's acquisition trail has vulnerabilities. She tapped the letter. It also means that if we can get enough witness testimony from within the valley, ranchers willing to describe the incidents, the pressure, the timeline, combined with the land office irregularities, we have the foundation for a federal investigation, not just a civil suit. Federal. Crow's operation crosses territorial lines. The financing is coming from out of state. The land is being acquired for a rail corridor that involves federal land grants. That makes it federal jurisdiction. She looked at him steadily, which means it goes beyond the county sheriff. Silas set the letter down. They both understood what she had not said, that the county sheriff, Tom Leary, had been conspicuously disinterested in every incident reported by Alliance members since the fall. Not obstructionist, nothing so overt. Simply unavailable, slowly responsive, mildly skeptical of the evidence placed before him in a manner that had become impossible to interpret as neutral. Leary is in his pocket, Silas said. I can't prove that either. Yet. She gathered the pages with careful, decisive movements. But I intend to. He watched her hands moving over the documents. She had long, capable hands. Hands that had always seemed to him more expressive than her face, which she controlled better. The hands gave things away sometimes. Right now they were moving with a kind of contained urgency that told him she was afraid and had decided not to be slowed down by the fear. Elena. His voice came out differently than he intended, quieter. She looked up. You've been carrying most of this, he said. Since December. She started to say something. He could see the prepared response forming, the practical deflection. He shook his head slightly. I'm not criticizing it, he said. He stopped. Navigated. I want you to know that I see it, what you've done here. Not just the documents, all of it. He looked at the table, at the papers, at the evidence of months of work that she had done in the mornings before he came downstairs, and in the evenings after he went up, and in every spare hour in between. I know why you came here. You needed a job and a roof, and that's fine, that's honest, but you didn't have to do any of this. Elena was quiet for a moment. Something in her face moved, not breaking open, nothing so dramatic, but a small shift in the careful architecture she maintained. Yes, I did, she said simply. Because it's right, and because, she paused, because this place matters. To you, and that matters. The kitchen was very still. Silas did not know, in that moment, what to do with what she had said. He was a man who had spent 3 years building very specific walls against exactly this, against mattering to someone, against allowing someone the knowledge that they had become necessary. He sat with the discomfort of it and did not retreat from the table, which was, for him, a significant act. "I'll talk to Deming and Alderman today," he said finally, "about gathering the witness statements. I'll go myself." She nodded, the practical language of what came next settling back over them like a familiar coat. But nothing was quite the same as it had been before he said what he'd said. The witness statements took 2 weeks to gather. Elena created a standardized form, not so formal as to intimidate, but structured enough to capture the details that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Silas rode out personally to 7 different ranches and sat at 7 different kitchen tables, and with a patience that had not been his natural characteristic 6 months ago, listened to 7 different families describe what had been done to them. He did not minimize what he heard. He did not offer empty assurance that everything would be fine, because he didn't know that it would be. He listened, and he asked careful questions, and he brought back the completed statements to Elena, who reviewed them, organized them, and spent an entire night copying every one by hand into the duplicate file that went to Cheyenne by the week's end. By mid-April, they had 14 signed witness statements. They had the burn evidence from the Frost Hollow fire. They had Elena's complete documentation going back to December, covering every incident and acquisition in the valley with dates, descriptions, and cross-reference timelines. They had the Cheyenne firm's preliminary findings on the land office irregularities. And they had the copies, all of it duplicated and held beyond any reach that Crow's operation could extend. It was not yet enough for a conviction, but it was enough for an investigation. The letter went to Cheyenne on a Friday. Elena sealed it herself, addressed it herself, and rode to the Millhaven post office herself, going in through the back at the postmaster's private entrance at a time when the main street was quiet, handing it directly to a man whose discretion she had tested twice before and found reliable. She came back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the April sky wide and blue above her, the mountains to the north still carrying snow at their peaks, while the lower slopes had gone green with the first real push of spring. The creek was running full and clear. The repaired section of the barn threw a new wood smell across the yard that was, somehow, not a bad smell at all. It was the smell of something rebuilt. Toby was in the east paddock working with one of the younger horses on a basic line exercise, his red hair bright in the afternoon light. He raised a hand when she came through the gate. She raised one back. Silas was on the porch. She hadn't seen him there initially. He was still in the way. He was still when he was thinking, which meant he could blend into the background of a place so completely that the eye moved past him. He was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed and his gaze on the middle distance, and he turned when he heard the wagon. She tied the mare and came up the porch steps. "It's sent," she said. He looked at her. "How long until we hear back?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. The firm needs to present the material formally before anyone in the land office can act on it officially. She stopped at the top of the porch step, one hand on the railing. "There's something else you need to know." His expression didn't change. He'd learned over these months not to brace visibly, but she could see it in the set of his shoulders. "I had a conversation with Bill Tanner at the post office." Tanner was the postmaster, and also, more relevantly, a man who saw every piece of paper that moved through Mill Haven. "He told me something in confidence. Crow's people came to him last week. They wanted to know if anyone connected to Frost Hollow Ranch had been sending significant correspondence outside the valley." The porch felt very quiet. "What did Tanner tell them?" Silas asked. "He told them he couldn't discuss other people's mail." She paused. "And then he came to find me." Silas held her gaze. "Crow knows something is in motion," she said. "He doesn't know exactly what, but he knows we're not just sitting and waiting." She straightened. "We should expect a response, and it won't be a polite visit from a consultant in a clean buggy." The following Tuesday, a rider came to Frost Hollow Ranch from town with a message that had been delivered to the Millhaven Hotel and left with the front desk. The message was addressed to Silas Granger, and it was written on expensive paper in careful handwriting, and it was brief. "Mr. Granger, I have obtained legal documentation demonstrating that the deed to Frost Hollow Ranch contains an unresolved encumbrance predating your grandfather's original title claim. In consequence, the property cannot be considered fully and legitimately in your possession. I have arranged for this matter to be properly adjudicated. You will receive formal notice within the week. I suggest you consult a lawyer, as the resolution of this matter will require your cooperation. D. Crow. Silas read it once. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the table and looked at it the way a man looks at something he is deciding how to classify. Threat, bluff, or something in between. Elena read it over his shoulder. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "There is no encumbrance," Silas said. His voice was very flat. "My grandfather's deed is clean. I've had it reviewed twice." "I know." She picked up the letter carefully, by the edge, as if preserving something on its surface. "This is a fabrication, which means somewhere, right now, someone is in the process of creating a document that doesn't exist. A forged foreclosure. A forged legal instrument of some kind." She looked at him. "He's going to try to take this ranch on paper, have it removed from you legally, or in the appearance of legally, before any investigation can formalize." Silas stood up from the table. He moved to the window, stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the yard. When he turned around, something had changed in his face. Not the anger. The anger was still there, contained and deliberate. But underneath it, or perhaps alongside it, was something else, a kind of absolute clarity. The look of a man who has been pushed to a specific place and has, upon arriving there, discovered that he is not afraid of it. "He wants this ranch," Silas said. "He can come and try to take it." Elena set the letter down. "Then we'd better be ready when he does." Outside, the April wind moved through the new green of the hills above Frost Hollow, and the horses in the paddock lifted their heads to it, and somewhere beyond the ridge the valley spread out wide and waiting in the long, particular light of a Wyoming spring that had earned itself through a hard winter and intended to be noticed. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday, delivered not by the regular post, but by a man on horseback who handed it to Toby at the gate and rode away before the boy could ask a single question. It was a thick envelope, official in its weight and presentation, bearing a territorial court seal that looked genuine to the untrained eye, and had Elena suspected cost Crow a considerable sum to fabricate convincingly. She and Silas sat at the kitchen table and read it together. The document claimed that Frost Hollow Ranch had been subject to an unresolved debt instrument dating to 1861, predating Silas's grandfather's original deed of ownership, and that this instrument had been legally transferred through a series of assignments, all conveniently documented in the attached papers, into the current possession of a landholding company called Meridian Territorial Partners. The document further claimed that Meridian had presented this instrument to the territorial court and received a judgment of foreclosure, and that the current occupant of the property, Silas Granger, was hereby notified to vacate within 14 days or face removal by order of the court. It was, from a distance, a masterwork of legal-looking fiction. The language was correct. The formatting was precise. The seal was convincing. But Elena had been reading legal documents since the year her husband's creditors began circling their farm, and she read this one the way a person reads a counterfeit bill, not for what it claimed to be, but for what it couldn't quite hide. "The 1861 debt instrument," she said, setting her finger on the second page. "It references a notary in Laramie City. Laramie City didn't exist under that name in 1861. She turned to the third page. The chain of assignment passes through a holding company incorporated in 1873. The debt it claims to be transferring predates that company's existence by 12 years. She looked up. "These are fabrications. Good ones, but fabrications." Silas had been reading alongside her, and she could see the controlled anger working in the line of his jaw. "Can we prove they're fabricated in 14 days? We don't need to prove it in 14 days. We need to make it irrelevant in 14 days. She stood and moved to the desk where the Cheyenne firm's correspondence was filed. "The forgeries actually help us. A real encumbrance could take months to untangle in court. A fabricated one we can demonstrate is fabricated, is evidence of fraud. Fraud changes the nature of what we're dealing with entirely." "What do we do?" She was already writing. "I send everything to Cheyenne tonight. The notice, the attached documents, my analysis of the inconsistencies. The firm will file for an emergency injunction to halt any enforcement action while the authenticity of the underlying documents is investigated." She looked up briefly. "And we send riders to every member of the alliance tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." Silas stood. "I'll go to Alderman myself." She nodded, still writing. "Tell him to bring everyone he can reach. Tell him what's happened. Tell him—" She paused, chose her words. "Tell him that if they don't stand with us now, they'll be standing alone when it's their turn. Because it will be their turn." He was putting on his coat before she finished the sentence. Toby appeared in the kitchen doorway, having heard enough through the walls to understand the shape of it, if not the precise details. He looked at Silas, then at Elena, with the expression of a young man trying to determine what was needed from him. "What do I do?" he said. Elena sealed the envelope she'd been writing and handed it to him. "You ride to town, the back road, not the main. You go to William Tanner's house, not the post office, his house, and you give him this and you wait while he reads the cover note. If he agrees to send it by the morning stage, you come back. If he doesn't—" She paused. "He will." Toby took the envelope with both hands and held it the way someone holds something they understand to be important. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. The night felt very long after they were both gone. Elena worked through it, moving between the desk and the kitchen table, cross-referencing dates and names and document numbers, building the analytical record that would support the forgery argument with the precision of someone who understood that, in a legal contest, detail was the only weapon that couldn't be taken away from you. The lamp burned low, and she trimmed it and kept working. Sometime around 2 a.m, she heard an owl in the pine trees on the ridge, a sound so ordinary and so separate from everything happening in the house that it briefly suspended the weight of it all, and she sat for a moment and simply listened. Then she picked up her pen and kept going. Silas returned before dawn. He came through the back door and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her across the room, at the papers spread over every surface, at the lamp, at the expression on her face that she didn't bother concealing because she was too tired. "Alderman's in," he said. "All of them. Every Alliance member." She let out a breath she hadn't fully known she was holding. "When?" "Saturday. Alderman's calling it as an emergency meeting, but they'll be ready to do more than meet if it comes to it." He came to the table and looked at the documents she'd been working on. "Toby?" "Back 2 hours ago. Asleep in the bunkhouse." Tanner agreed. Silas sat down. He looked at the lamp, at the papers, at her hands resting on the table beside the pen. Then he looked at her face. "You haven't slept," he said. "Not yet." "Elena." He said her name with a weight that was not reproach but something adjacent to concern, which from Silas Granger was its own specific language. "I'll sleep when it's done," she said. Not defensively, just factually. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, went to the stove, and put water on. He came back and sat across from her and looked at the document she'd been working on. "Walk me through it," he said. "What you found." So she did. For an hour, in the small cold space before dawn, she walked him through every inconsistency in the forged notice, every fabricated link in the fraudulent chain of title, every date that didn't align, and every name that couldn't be verified, and every seal that had been placed on paper by someone who'd studied real documents carefully, but not carefully enough. He listened the way he'd learned to listen over these months, completely, without interruption, following the logic of it with the same focused intelligence he applied to everything he cared about. When she finished, he said, "You should have been a lawyer." She almost smiled. "I should have been a lot of things." She gathered the pages into order. "What I am is enough." Something in his expression moved. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked at the window, where the sky was beginning the very first gray suggestion of dawn. "Yes," he said quietly. "You are." The 14-day notice window became, in practice, a 10-day countdown, because on the 4th day after the notice was delivered, word reached Frost Hollow Ranch through Frank Alderman that Sheriff Tom Leary had been seen meeting privately with 2 men who worked for Damian Crow's operation. Not at the sheriff's office, but at a private residence on the edge of Millhaven in the evening with the curtains drawn. Alderman delivered this information in person, riding out on a Saturday morning with the tight expression of a man who has confirmed something he'd suspected and taken no pleasure in the confirmation. "It's Leary," he said. They were in the yard, the 3 of them, Silas, Elena, and Alderman, because the conversation was one that nobody wanted inside the house, as if the open air made it less real and more manageable. "He's going to enforce the foreclosure notice. He told Ed Breyer at the feed store that he has a legal order and he intends to execute it." He can't enforce a fraudulent order, Elena said. He can if nobody stops him before he tries. Alderman looked at Silas. He'll come with men. Crow's people wearing deputy badges, most likely. Temporary appointments? Leary has the authority to make them. He paused. I think they'll come at night. Silas looked at the road, at the long gravel drive that led from the main road to the house, at the terrain he'd known since childhood. Every rise and depression, every sight line, every place where a group of men could approach with some concealment or where a group of men waiting would have the advantage of ground. Then we don't give them the night, he said. We give them something else instead. The plan that formed over the following 48 hours was Elena's in its architecture and Silas's in its execution, which was perhaps the clearest expression of what they had each become to the other over these months. Her building the structure of it, him understanding instinctively how to inhabit it. Every alliance member was notified of the probable timeline. Alderman organized the logistics with the efficiency of someone who had managed large operations all his adult life. Riders were sent. Times were established. A secondary communication went to the Cheyenne firm, informing them of the likely enforcement attempt and requesting that their territorial court contact be prepared to act on short notice. The most important communication was the one Elena sent to a territorial journalist named Harlan Moss, who worked for the Wyoming Territory Courier in Cheyenne and had, 6 weeks earlier, responded to a carefully worded letter she'd sent him with genuine and specific interest. She told Moss what was coming and when, and she told him that if he arrived in Millhaven within the week, he would have a story that would be read in every territorial capital east of the Rockies. She told him she would provide documentation he could verify independently. She sent the letter and told no one she'd sent it, and then she went back to work. On the Wednesday of the following week, Toby came to the house at dusk with the expression of someone carrying news he hadn't been asked to carry but couldn't keep to himself. There's a rider on the main road, he said. Stopped at the gate. Says his name is Moss. Says he's expected. Elena dried her hands on the dishcloth and went to the door. The journalist was a compact, dark-haired man in his mid-30s who arrived with a notebook, a direct gaze, and the specific kind of stillness that people who have spent years listening to other people tend to develop. He shook Elena's hand at the door, looked around the yard with the practiced observational sweep of someone cataloging a scene, and said, "You're the one who's been building the case." "I'm one of them," she said. "Come inside." She gave Moss 3 hours that evening. She walked him through the documentation systematically, from the December ledger entries through the witness statements, through the forged foreclosure notice, and her analysis of its fabrications. She gave him copies of everything. Not the originals, those stayed at Frost Hollow and in Cheyenne, but clean, complete copies organized with the same precision as the originals. Silas sat at the far end of the table for most of it, largely silent, speaking only when Moss addressed him directly with a question about the ranch's history or the specific incidents that had occurred on the property. He answered without embellishment, which Moss seemed to understand was itself a form of credibility. At the end of the 3 hours, Moss closed his notebook and looked across the table. "This is substantial," he said. "The forgeries alone, if I can get them verified by a document examiner, and I know one in Denver, will be a significant story. The full pattern, with the witness statements, is something else entirely." He paused. "Are you prepared for what happens when this publishes?" "It won't stay in Wyoming." "I'm counting on it not staying in Wyoming," Elena said. Moss looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "When do you expect them to come?" "Thursday," Silas said from the end of the table. "Friday at the latest. They'll want it resolved before the weekend when more people might be in town and paying attention." Moss nodded slowly. "I'll be here." Thursday came in cold and clear, the high Wyoming spring still carrying the memory of winter in its pre-dawn temperatures, the sky above the ranch absolute and star-filled in the hours before the light came. Elena was awake before 4, which had long since stopped being unusual. She dressed, went downstairs, and stood at the kitchen window for a moment looking at the dark yard and the darker shapes of the buildings and the faint outline of the ridge against the sky. Then she put water on and went to wake Toby. By 6 in the morning, the first of the Alliance riders had come through the east gate. They came in 1s and 2s mostly, timed to avoid drawing attention from anyone watching the main road. Frank Alderman arrived first, ahead of everyone, and he and Silas stood in the yard in the early light and spoke quietly for a few minutes, with the particular economy of men who have agreed on a course of action and don't need to revisit it. Roy Deming came with his older son, Cass Beaumont, Josiah Holt and his brother-in-law. By 8 o'clock, 16 men were on the property, some in the barn, some in the outbuildings, some simply standing in the yard in the open where they could be seen from the road. Elena moved among them with the calm of someone who had done everything she could do and was now simply present. She had the documentation in a leather satchel, originals, organized, ready. She had Moss positioned in the house with a clear view of the yard. She had Toby at the gate with instructions. What she had not entirely planned for was the feeling of it, the physical reality of 16 people who had come without compulsion and without certainty about the outcome, to stand on this piece of ground because they decided it was the right thing to do. She felt it in a way that bypassed analysis, landing somewhere more fundamental than thought. At 10:47 in the morning, a group of riders appeared on the main road. Toby counted them from the gate and came back at a run. 9, he said, slightly breathless. Sheriff Leary in front, 6 men I don't recognize, carrying rifles, and 2 others. He paused. Mr. Crow is one of them, in a carriage. The yard went quiet in the particular way that places go quiet when people are paying a different quality of attention. Silas looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't require words, had not required words for some time now. Open the gate, Silas said to Toby. Let them come. Crow arrived the way powerful men arrive when they believe the contest is already decided, with the comfortable authority of someone attending a formality. He stepped out of his carriage into the yard of Frost Hollow Ranch and looked around at the assembled ranchers with an expression that moved over approximately 3 seconds from satisfaction through confusion to something harder to name. He had expected a frightened man standing alone. The yard held 16 ranchers, a journalist with a notebook already open, and Elena Hartwell standing beside Silas Granger with a leather satchel and an expression of absolute composure. Sheriff Leary pulled up his horse and looked around the yard with the expression of a man who is rapidly recalculating his position and finding the new numbers uncomfortable. Silas Granger, Leary said. He had a carrying voice and was using it, establishing authority by volume because the other kind was already slipping. I have a legal order of foreclosure on this property. You are hereby required to vacate. Which order? Elena said. Leary looked at her. Ma'am, this is an official. I'm asking which order. She opened the satchel and produced a document, holding it so Leary could see it without taking it from her hand. Because the order delivered to this property 7 days ago references a debt instrument from 1861 notarized in a town that did not exist under that name in 1861. It also references a holding company incorporated in 1873 that claims to hold an instrument predating it by 12 years. She paused. I have a 12-page analysis of the document's fabrications, prepared in consultation with a territorial law firm in Cheyenne. I also have their filing for an emergency injunction, which was accepted by the territorial court 3 days ago. She let that settle for a moment. Is that the order you're here to enforce, Sheriff? Leary's carrying voice did not carry anything for a moment. Crow stepped forward. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and was now simply commanding, a face accustomed to being the most important one in any room. He looked at Elena with the particular contempt of someone who has underestimated a person once and is in the process of understanding the cost of it. Miss Hartwell, he said. His voice was smooth and controlled. I don't know what you think you've assembled here, but a stack of papers in a room full of dirt farmers doesn't constitute— Mr. Moss, Elena said, without raising her voice. The journalist stepped onto the porch from the house doorway, notebook in hand. Crow looked at him. Something shifted in the commanding face. Not fear, not quite, but the particular attention of a man who has just seen a piece on a board he didn't know was there. Harlan Moss, Elena said, Wyoming Territory Courier. He has complete copies of the documentation, the witness statements from 14 Valley ranchers, the analysis of the forged instruments, the Cheyenne firm's findings on the land office irregularities in your acquisition filings. She looked at Crow steadily. He also has the name of a document examiner in Denver who has agreed to review the 1861 debt instrument and provide an expert opinion on its authenticity. She paused. For publication. The yard was absolutely silent. Crow looked at Elena, then at Silas, then at the 16 ranchers arrayed across the yard, men who had worked this land for decades, men whose names were woven into the valley's history, men who were looking back at him with the specific and unified expression of people who have decided together that they are not moving. "Sheriff," Crow said it quietly. Leary looked at the injunction copy Elena had produced. He looked at the journalist. He looked at the ranchers. He was a man who had made a calculation some months ago about which side of a contest held the better odds, and that calculation had just changed on him in a yard full of witnesses. He looked at Crow and said, "The injunction is filed. I can't enforce the order while it's under review." "Tom, I can't enforce it." Leary's voice was flat and final. He had the expression of a man stepping off a ship that is sinking and being willing to swim for it. Crow turned to the 6 armed men he'd brought. They were men who'd been hired for their willingness to be present and imposing, and who were now doing the arithmetic of what they were being asked to be present and imposing against. 16 ranchers on their own ground, a legal injunction, and a journalist writing things down. One of them, without a word, turned his horse, then a second. Within 30 seconds, 4 of the 6 had separated themselves from Crow's immediate vicinity without formally departing, which was the particular geometry of men withdrawing from a bad bet. Damian Crow stood in the yard of Frost Hollow Ranch and understood, with the specific clarity that comes only in moments of complete reversal, that he was alone. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with no particular expression at all. Not triumph. Triumph would have required some emotional access that was, for Silas, still not entirely available. But certainty. The absolute, settled certainty of a man standing on ground that is his. "You should go," Silas said. His voice was not loud and not soft. It was simply what it was. Crow held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Elena once more, a long look, the look of a man filing something away, and turned without another word and walked back to his carriage. The carriage turned around in the yard and went back down the drive toward the main road. Leary followed without speaking to anyone. The remaining hired men trailed after, spreading out along the road with the loose, purposeless movement of a force that has been relieved of its purpose. No one in the yard spoke until the last of them had passed the gate. Then Roy Deming let out a long, slow breath that seemed to speak for everyone. Frank Alderman came to stand beside Silas. He looked at the empty drive, at the gate, at the retreating dust on the road. He stroked his beard. "Well," he said. "Yeah," said Silas. Elena was already at Moss's side, speaking quietly, walking him through the sequence of what had just happened and what came next, because she understood, better than anyone present, that the departure from this yard was not an ending but a transition, and that the work of ensuring it was a permanent one was still in front of them. Toby Reed, standing near the paddock fence where he had spent the confrontation trying to look older than 16, exhaled and then immediately tried to pretend he hadn't. Cass Beaumont noticed and put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "You did good," Beaumont said. "All of it. Every bit of today." Toby straightened slightly. "Yes, sir," he said, which was the only response he could manage without his voice doing something embarrassing. Inside the house, on the kitchen table, Elena's ledger lay open to the most recent page. At the top of the page, in her precise, even handwriting, she had written a single date, and beneath it a single line. They came. We held. Harlan Moss left Frost Hollow Ranch the following morning with a saddlebag full of copied documents and the particular energy of a journalist who understands that what he is carrying will matter. He shook Silas's hand at the gate, nodded to Toby, and then turned to Elena and held her gaze for a moment before he spoke. "How long did you know it would come to that?" he asked. Meaning the yard, the confrontation, the precise sequence of it. "Since December," she said, "when I understood what he was." Moss looked at her steadily. "The story I write, you'll be in it. Your name, what you built here." He paused, giving her the opportunity to object. She didn't object. "Write it accurately," she said. "That's all I ask." He wrote out. Elena watched him go and then turned back toward the house, where the kitchen table still held the remnants of the previous day's documentation and the lamp she'd forgotten to extinguish until nearly noon. She had slept 9 hours the night before, which was the most she had slept in a single stretch since October, and she had woken feeling not rested exactly, but emptied of the specific tension that had occupied her body for so many months that she'd stopped noticing it until its absence made itself felt. The Alliance ranchers had departed the afternoon before in good spirits. With the careful, contained satisfaction of men who do not celebrate before a thing is fully finished, but who are also honest enough with themselves to acknowledge when a significant turn has been made. Alderman had been last to leave. He'd stood with Silas at the gate for a long while, the two of them talking in the low, unhurried way of men who are revising an old understanding of each other. And when he finally mounted his horse, he'd looked back at the house where Elena was visible through the kitchen window and said to Silas, without particular ceremony, "You'd have lost this place without her." Silas had said, "I know." Alderman had nodded once and ridden home. The weeks that followed were not quiet, precisely, but they were a different quality of busy. The busy of aftermath rather than crisis, which has its own demands but does not carry the same weight. The Cheyenne firm's injunction held. Crow's lawyers filed a response, as expected, and the territorial court scheduled a formal hearing for late May, at which point the question of the foreclosure instrument's authenticity would be addressed on the record. Elena prepared for that hearing with the same methodical intensity she'd brought to every other phase of it, adding to her documentation, communicating weekly with the firm, ensuring that every piece of evidence was organized and cross-referenced and could survive the scrutiny of a formal legal proceeding. She added 3 more witness statements, ranchers who had been reluctant before, but who, emboldened by what had happened in the yard at Frost Hollow, came forward now with accounts they'd kept private for months. Harlan Moss's article appeared in the Wyoming Territory Courier on a Tuesday in early May, and it was not the small regional story that Crow had presumably calculated would be the worst-case outcome. It ran across the full front page under a headline that Elena read 3 times standing at the kitchen table, the paper spread open in front of her. The piece was thorough, factual, and devastating. It named Crow, it named Leary, it traced the pattern of acquisitions and incidents with the precision of her own documentation because it had been built from that documentation, and it placed the forged foreclosure instruments in the context of a broader pattern of fraud that the Cheyenne firm's land office findings had illuminated. It was picked up by 3 other territorial papers within the week. By the second week, it had reached newspapers in Denver and Salt Lake City. By the end of May, a letter arrived at Frost Hollow Ranch bearing a federal seal. Silas brought it in from the gate and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it with the expression of a man who has learned over a hard year not to assign meaning to things before he understands them. Elena picked it up and read it. Then she set it down and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "Federal investigators," she said. "They want to meet with us, both of us, and with the Alliance members." "When?" 3 weeks. She looked up at him. "They're coming from Cheyenne. The letter mentions the land office irregularities specifically, and the forged instruments, and—" she paused, "and the intimidation campaign against Valley ranchers as a potential violation of federal statutes protecting homestead rights." Silas was quiet for a moment. "It's real," he said. Not a question, but the specific statement of a man who has wanted something to be true and is arriving at the moment of believing it. "It's real," she confirmed. He pulled out a chair and sat down, not with the weight of defeat, that sitting down he had done many times over these years, and she knew the quality of it. This was different. This was a man putting down something he'd been carrying. "Elena." He said her name the way he'd been saying it lately, with a care that was uncharacteristic of him, and that she had been, in her methodical way, quietly cataloging alongside everything else. She sat across from him. "When this is finished," he said, and then stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, and she recognized the expression, the one he wore when he was working on something that mattered enough to make him careful with the words. "It won't be finished in 3 weeks," she said gently. "The federal process will take months." "I know." He looked up. "That's not what I'm asking." She held his gaze. The kitchen was full of the particular May light that came through the window above the sink in the morning, clean and slightly golden, the kind of light that had no patience for pretense. "I know what you're asking," she said. Then, "Ask it," she said, out loud. Something moved in his face. The closest thing to self-consciousness she had ever seen from him, which on Silas Granger looked like courage. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as a ranch hand, Not because the work requires it. He paused. I want you to stay because this place is... He stopped again. She waited. Because whatever this place is now, it's partly because of you, and I can't imagine it going back to what it was. He held her gaze. I don't want it to. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the May wind moved through the new grass in the east pasture, and somewhere in the paddock, one of the horses nickered at something in the morning, and the ridge above the ranch stood green and clear against a sky that had decided, for today, to be as uncomplicated as possible. She thought about the woman who had come up this drive 8 months ago with a worn travel bag and nowhere else to go. She thought about what she had been then, stripped down, emptied out, holding herself together by the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that surviving was a choice she intended to keep making. She thought about what this place had been then, and what it had become, and how it had become it. She thought about Silas Granger, who had not known he needed anyone and had needed someone quite badly, and who had been, underneath the walls and the silence and the 3 years of self-imposed isolation, one of the most fundamentally decent men she had ever encountered. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He let out a breath. It was barely audible, but she heard it. Good, he said, which was, from Silas Granger, quite a lot. Toby Reed, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 45 seconds into this conversation while looking for coffee, and who had then very slowly and very silently begun to back out of the doorway, knocked his elbow into the doorframe and knocked a hanging pothook off the wall with a clatter that was so dramatically ill-timed that Elena put her face in her hands, and Silas turned around with an expression that existed in the precise space between exasperation and the suppression of something else entirely. Sorry, Toby said. His ears were the color of a barn at sunset. There's work. Outside. He picked up the pothook, set it on the counter, and left at a pace that was technically not running. The sound of his boots on the porch steps receded. Then there was silence. Then Elena looked up from her hands, and Silas looked at her, and after 11 months of careful containment and practical language and work conducted in mutual proximity, they both laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laughter that releases something that has been under pressure for a long time. It moved through the kitchen like something that had been waiting for permission. The federal investigators arrived in the second week of June, a team of 3 men from the Territorial Land Office, accompanied by a federal marshal whose presence indicated the seriousness with which the complaint had been received in Cheyenne. They came to Frost Hollow Ranch first, spent 2 full days reviewing Elena's documentation, and left with expressions that she had learned from months of reading people under pressure to interpret as professionally controlled satisfaction. They then proceeded to meet with every Alliance member in turn, gathering testimony from 14 ranchers across the valley in a process that took the better part of 2 weeks. The Cheyenne firm's lawyers were present throughout, and Harlan Moss, who had returned to the valley with the specific tenacity of a journalist who understands that the story is not over, was present at every public session. Damian Crow, during all of this, was conspicuously absent from Clearwater Valley. His office in Cheyenne had issued a statement through his personal lawyers asserting that the allegations were without merit and that Mr. Crow looked forward to addressing them through proper legal channels. The proper legal channels were already closing around him from multiple directions simultaneously, which was precisely what Elena had spent 6 months engineering. Tom Leary resigned as county sheriff on a Thursday afternoon, citing personal reasons, which was the polite fiction that allowed him to depart without immediate arrest. The federal investigation into his conduct was ongoing and would remain so for several months, during which time his cooperation with the investigators, cooperation that he provided with the pragmatic expediency of a man trying to negotiate the best outcome from a bad position, proved instrumental in establishing the direct links between Crow's operation and the specific incidents that had terrorized the valley. The Land Office findings were formalized in late June. 7 of Crow's 12 valley acquisitions contained fraudulent elements in their documentation, rendering those transactions legally void. The affected ranchers, including Harlan Pruitt and the others who had sold under duress, were notified that their cases would be reviewed, and in 4 of those cases, the original owners were able to reclaim their properties through the subsequent legal proceedings, with the fraudulent sale prices partially recovered as damages. Crow himself was indicted in August on charges of land fraud, document forgery, intimidation, and conspiracy. a list that, when it appeared in the Wyoming Territory Courier under Harlan Moss's byline, occupied most of the front page. His Eastern financial backers, recognizing the ship for what it was, had begun distancing themselves from his operation before the indictment was handed down, which meant that by the time the full weight of the legal proceedings descended on Damian Crowe, he was facing it with diminished resources and the specific isolation of a powerful man who has lost the ability to make himself useful to other powerful men. The Valley had won, not cleanly, nothing involving courts and investigations, and the slow machinery of formal accountability was ever clean, but conclusively. Elena recorded all of it in the ledger, right up to the last official notification from the Cheyenne firm that the emergency injunction on Frost Hollow Ranch had been formally dissolved because the fraudulent instruments had been voided and there was nothing left to enjoin. She wrote the date at the top of the page, wrote 2 sentences summarizing the resolution, and then closed the ledger and set it on the desk shelf where she kept the completed volumes. She stood for a moment looking at it on the shelf, this one and the ones before it, the accumulated record of a year spent paying attention to things that mattered. Then she went downstairs to help with supper. The Ranchers' Alliance did not dissolve when the external threat that had created it was removed. This surprised some of its members and surprised none of the others. What Crowe's campaign of intimidation had accidentally created, by forcing isolated ranchers to choose between standing alone and standing together, was a network of trust and mutual obligation that proved, in the absence of crisis, to be genuinely valuable. Fencing crews rotated across properties in the spring. Shared equipment reduced individual costs. When Josiah Holt's wife fell ill in the summer and Holt needed to be home for 3 weeks, the other members covered his operations without being asked and without keeping count. Frank Alderman called it practical. Roy Deming called it common sense. Cass Beaumont, who was the youngest of the group and the most willing to say things directly, called it what it was, a community, where before there had been only neighbors. At Frost Hollow Ranch, the summer settled in with the particular richness of a season that follows a hard winter and a harder spring. The pastures came in full and green. The repaired barn, seasoned now through a spring and into a summer, had lost its new wood rawness and taken on the permanence of something that belonged where it stood. The horses moved through the east paddock in the long evening light with the unhurried ease of animals that understand, in the wordless way of animals, that the place they occupy is safe. Toby Reed turned 17 in July and received, as a birthday acknowledgement from Silas, an upgrade from 3 days a week to full-time employment, delivered without ceremony in the form of a simple statement over breakfast. "You're here every day now." Toby had nodded as if this were a minor logistical adjustment, rather than something he would remember for the rest of his life, and then excused himself to the barn, where Elena later found evidence that he had spent a brief period sitting on a hay bale doing nothing, which she identified as a young man needing a moment and left entirely alone. The summer deepened. The days grew long and full of work that was, for the first time in years, the work of building rather than the work of defending. New fencing in the south pasture. A proper repair of the smokehouse that Elena had been mentally planning since January. A kitchen garden, her idea, proposed in April and begun in May, that by August was producing more than 2 people and one perpetually hungry 17-year-old could consume, which meant the surplus went to Alderman's place and occasionally to the Beaumont family, who had 3 young children and accepted garden vegetables with the specific gratitude of people who have learned not to take reliable things for granted. On a Saturday evening in late August, Silas found Elena in the garden at the end of the day, the low western light falling across the rows of green in a way that made the whole thing look like something from a painting. She was kneeling beside a row of late beans with a basket on her arm, working in the comfortable silence of someone engaged in a task that required attention but not urgency. He stood at the garden's edge for a moment and looked at her, and then he looked at the garden, and then at the house behind him with the lamplight already warming the kitchen window, and then at the ridge above the property where the pine trees stood dark and permanent against the evening sky. He thought about his grandfather, who had built the stone foundation of that house with the intention of outlasting himself. He thought about Daniel, whose absence had turned the place into something between a refuge and a punishment for so long that Silas had stopped being able to tell the difference. He thought about a November morning 8 months ago when a wagon had come up the drive and a woman had climbed down from it with a single bag and a chin that came up before she'd said a word. Elena looked up from the beans and found him watching her. "There are more on the East End," she said, which was not what she was thinking, but was what came out, because she was also, despite everything, a practical person. "Elena," he said. She set the basket down and stood. Something in his voice had the particular quality that she had learned to distinguish from his other registers, the voice he used when he had been working on something carefully and had arrived at the point of saying it. He came to the garden's edge, and she came to meet him, and the evening light was very soft, and the valley below was quiet in the way it was quiet on good evenings, with only the sounds that belonged to it, wind in the grass, a bird somewhere in the pines, the distant sound of the creek running through the low ground to the south. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small. She couldn't see it clearly in the fading light until he held it out toward her, and then she could. A ring, simple, unadorned, sized with the specific accuracy of a man who had been paying close attention for a long time. "I've been carrying this since June," he said. "I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I kept deciding the moment wasn't right yet, and I finally understood that I was going to keep deciding that indefinitely if I let myself." He looked at her steadily. "So this is the moment. This one, right here." Elena looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the ring again. "You had it made in June," she said. "May," he corrected, with the scrupulous honesty that was one of his most fundamental qualities. "I had it made in May. I've been carrying it for 3 months." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been, when she arrived, so sealed against the world that the valley had written him off as permanently unreachable, who had apologized to Frank Alderman in 4 words, and meant every one of them, who had practiced that apology alone in the barn because he wanted to get it right, who had sat at the kitchen table in the small hours learning the shape of a problem so he could carry some of it, who had said, "I know," when Alderman told him what she had done for this place, and who had meant that too, as simply and completely as he meant everything. "Ask me properly," she said softly. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, visible in the eyes before anything else. "Elena Hartwell," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not quite a question, which she found in its way perfect. It was more like a statement of what he understood to be true, said in the form of a question as a courtesy to her right to confirm it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, Silas." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady in the way his hands were always steady, and she thought fleetingly of the first morning she'd come downstairs to find the kitchen warm and the coffee made, of all the mornings after that, of the weight of a fence-post mallet and the smell of new wood and the sound of his voice saying "good work," when he could not yet manage anything more but was trying. He kept hold of her hand after the ring was placed, which was, from him, the gesture of a man who intended to be clear. She covered his hand with her other one. They stood in the garden while the light finished failing and the first stars came out over the Wyoming ridge, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed to be said, and because they were both, in their different ways, people who understood the value of a silence that held something rather than hiding from it. Toby found out the next morning when he came to breakfast and noticed the ring, because Toby noticed most things even when he pretended not to, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked from Elena's hand to Silas's face to Elena's face and then said, "Well, it's about time," in the voice of someone who has been exercising considerable patience. Silas looked at him. "Congratulations," Toby added quickly. "Sir, ma'am." "Sit down and eat," Silas said. Toby sat down and ate, but he was smiling into his coffee cup in a way he made no serious attempt to conceal, and Elena, who could see it from where she stood at the stove, let him. The wedding was held on the first Saturday of October, which was Clearwater Valley's finest month. The aspen on the ridge gone gold, the air cold enough to remind you of winter without being it yet, the sky the particular shade of blue that only appeared in the high country in autumn, deep and saturated and seemingly infinite. Frank Alderman offered his property for the gathering because it was the largest in the valley, and he made the offer in the direct, unornamented way he did most things, simply appearing at Frost Hollow one morning and saying, "Use my land. I have room." And that was that. The valley came. Not just the Alliance ranchers, the whole valley, or very nearly. Families who had watched from a distance all year, who had followed the story through Harlan Moss's articles, and through the accumulated conversations of a small community that misses very little, who understood, even if they hadn't been present in the yard on that April morning, what had happened here and what it meant. They came with food and with the particular warmth of people who are celebrating something larger than a wedding, a proof, a demonstration, the visible evidence that the thing they had feared had been survived, and that the valley they lived in had held together when it mattered. Elena wore her best dress, which Alderman's wife had quietly and without announcement had altered and pressed in the week before, presenting it to Elena on the morning of the wedding with the brisk practicality of a woman who understood that the gesture would be better received without ceremony. Silas wore his best coat, which Toby had brushed and hung the night before without being asked. They stood in the open air with the gold ridge behind them and the valley spread below in the October light, and the ranchers and their families stood in a wide circle around them, and the words were spoken simply by the valley's retired circuit judge, who drove 2 hours to be there and refused any payment and ate 3 pieces of pie at the reception, which he felt was fair. When it was done and the gathered crowd expressed its approval in the uncomplicated, generous way of people who are genuinely happy about something, Elena looked at Silas beside her and found him looking back at her with an expression that she had no word for and did not need one. Harlan Moss was there with his notebook, because he was constitutionally unable to be at a significant event without one. But he did not write anything during the ceremony. He closed the notebook and put it in his coat pocket and watched, and later when he wrote the final piece about Clearwater Valley and what had happened there over the course of a year, he would describe the wedding not as a celebration but as a kind of culmination, the moment when a valley that had been under siege became unmistakably and permanently a community. The Damien Crowe case moved through the territorial court system through the fall and into the following year with the slow, grinding thoroughness of formal legal proceedings that have solid evidence and motivated prosecutors. The fraud charges held. The forgery charges held. The conspiracy charges, built substantially on testimony from 2 of his former hired men who had accepted cooperation agreements in exchange for reduced exposure, held most substantially of all. By the following spring, Crowe's legal situation had resolved in the way that such situations resolve when the evidence is sufficient and the will to prosecute is genuine, badly for Damien Crowe, and conclusively for everyone he had attempted to take from. The valley land that had been fraudulently acquired was worked back through the courts over 18 months, a process that was slow and imperfect, but ultimately restored most of it to its rightful owners or their legal assigns. The railroad corridor was eventually built, years later, along a slightly different alignment than Crowe had planned, and the land value that had made the corridor so attractive proved beneficial to the ranchers who had refused to sell at any price. Their properties, adjacent to the new route, increased in value without the loss of the land itself. The Ranchers Alliance was formally incorporated as the Clearwater Valley Cooperative in the following year, with Frank Alderman as its first elected chairman and Elena Granger. She had taken his name without deliberation. It simply seemed to her to be the name that fit the life. As its secretary, a role she discharged with the same meticulous attention she had applied to everything else, and which transformed the cooperative's records into a model of clarity that other regional organizations would reference for decades. Frost Hollow Ranch endured. The stone foundation held as it had been built to hold. The repaired barn settled into the landscape until it was indistinguishable from the original, which is what a repair aspires to be. The kitchen garden grew back each spring, improved by Elena's careful attention to soil and rotation, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has learned that things which seem finished sometimes require only time and consistent care to come back stronger. Toby Reed worked the ranch for 5 more years before acquiring a property of his own in the northern end of the valley, a modest operation that he built methodically and ran with the specific combination of practicality and loyalty that he had learned in the years at Frost Hollow. He rode back to visit every few months for the rest of his life, and the visits never required invitation and were never announced in advance, and were always welcome. In the spring, the aspen on the ridge put out their leaves in that particular trembling way that aspens have, each leaf catching light and wind independently, making the whole hillside seem to breathe. In the summer, the east pasture filled out thick and green. In the fall, the ridge went gold again, reliably, in the way that things which have been in a place long enough achieve reliability. In the winter, snow came down from the mountains and covered the valley in the silence that only winter in high country can produce, absolute and deep, and full of something that was not quite peace, but was close enough. In the mornings, the kitchen was always warm before dawn. The coffee was always made, and the light through the east window, falling across the table where a ledger had once been opened to fresh pages of careful notes, fell now across the ordinary and extraordinary evidence of a life being lived. A cup, a plate, a hand resting on the table beside another hand, the simple and sufficient proof that two people who had both learned, by different and difficult roads, to expect very little from the world, had found in this cold and beautiful piece of Wyoming land something they had not known to look for. Not rescue, not luck, not the erasure of what they had each carried. Just this, the quiet, sturdy, daily truth that the hardest winters end. That broken things, given time and care and the right hands working on them, can be made not just functional, but strong. That a lonely man is not always a lost one. That a homeless woman carries a home inside her, in the quality of her attention and the precision of her care, waiting for a place worthy of being put down. The frontier had not been kind to either of them. It had not promised anything it had not then attempted to take back. It had been cold and hard and indifferent in the way that land is indifferent, not cruel, simply itself, asking only whether you were equal to it. They had been equal to it, and in the place where a ranch that everyone believed would fail had been given back to itself, where a valley that had trembled under the weight of one man's greed had found the courage to stand together, where a boy had grown into his own best version of himself over 3 years of cold mornings and hard work, and people who treated him as capable of becoming something. In that place, the lights were on. They were always on, now. End.